listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
It's the anniversary of the Iraq War. I had to go into hiding because someone threatened to shoot me in the brain 3 times. Not then, now, this weekend. And we'll be talking about the allegation by the President of the United States that his opposite number in Russia is a killer. Wow, that is serious business. We'll be asking about the right to protest, which seems to have been abolished in Britain. And we'll be asking you in a poll, who gets to protest? Just those we like, or everyone? Or in the time of the coronavirus, maybe no one at all. We'll be talking about the coronavirus and the lockdown. And we'll be talking about Labour as they slip ever further behind in the polls under Sir Keith Starmer, who we were assured would be 20 points ahead. And then, of course, there's the issue of Scottish nationalism. I've got a fair bit to say about that. This is rock and roll radio with pictures. So fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy ride, I promise you. This is the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
And this is London, of course, but you can watch and listen to us all over the world, as people increasingly do. If you're in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen in perfect clarity on FM on 105.5. You can listen throughout the United States on AM from Burning City to Burning City. You can listen all over the world thanks to Radio Sputnik, SputnikRadio.com. But if you're one of the 500,000 every week now, who watch as well as listen to the show, I've got a message for you. As you know, Big Algorithm is constantly trying to, interrupt us. Sometimes even with the aid of the French government, TF2, a matter which has not yet been resolved to my satisfaction. But the best way, if you are watching on Facebook, on my Facebook page, or on RT's multiple Facebook pages, is right now to share, and share. Press the button. Share with all of your friends. Tell them we are now live, because Facebook certainly won't do so. If you're watching on YouTube, either on my own YouTube channel, do subscribe if you are, or on RT's multiple YouTube channels, you're welcome too. You can also watch us on your phone, on Twitter, which an ever larger number of you do. I never believed that people would watch TV on their phone, but they sure are watching this on their phone in bigger numbers every week. You can also watch on Twitch, and you can follow on my Telegram channel. I've forgotten the address of that Telegram channel yet again. It's apparently t.me/George Galloway. There it is there. Do follow me on that because, if Big Algorithm gets his way, we'll ultimately end up on that platform and no other. Now, it was right now on the 20th of March in 2003 that Operation Shock and Awe was launched against Iraq. The drumbeats of war had been playing for a considerable run-up. I was one of the leaders of the great movement which grew up around the whole world to try and stop this disaster. I was in Parliament and I was on the streets and I was on television and radio and in the newspapers. And in the latter, I was treated as quite possibly mad, maybe bad, and quite possibly both. Everything I said about the invasion and occupation of Iraq turned out to be true. Everything that Tony Blair and George W. Bush said turned out to be false, except where it was a deliberate falsehood. Never was a war of such moment ushered in a blizzard of such lies and deceptions. It was truly a weapon of mass deception that led us into a war which reverberates still, which has cascaded extremism, fanaticism, and hate, and death and blood all over the world. All those who supported it kept their jobs. Some were promoted. Many have prospered. All those who opposed it lost their jobs, like me, like Piers Morgan, then the editor of the Daily Mirror, like Greg Dyke, then the Director General of the BBC, like Andrew Gilligan, then a star reporter on BBC Radio 4, and like, of course, the subject of my forthcoming film, Killing Kelly, Dr. David Kelly, the weapons scientist who began to go rogue from the point of view of the British security services, who are just next door and are no doubt listening raptly to this address. The war, it scarcely needs now to be said, has been an unmitigated disaster. For Iraq, of course, 1 million Iraqis were killed in the invasion and during the occupation, and as a result of the uncontrollable forces that were unleashed by the invasion and the occupation itself. As President Barack Obama himself said, it just goes to show you better look before you shoot. But they didn't look before they shot, or rather, they didn't allow us to do so. They presented an absolutely fake case for a war which they said could not be avoided, when in fact their case was a tissue of lies, a pack of lies, as I put it at that now famous session of the United States Senate. It was the mother of all smokescreens, and it fooled a lot of people, a lot of members of Parliament, a lot of members of the public, and of course it could count on the virtually automatic support of the Fourth Estate, which is supposed to hold government to account and subject their arguments to critical and forensic analysis. But the media in the run-up to the war were Tony Blair fans with typewriters. That's all. Andrew Marr may have been the most rank, but there were many, many Andrew Marrs. Andrew Marr, who stood outside number 10 on this day in 2003, as Iraq was lit up by high ordnance fired from the sky by the United States and the United Kingdom, and one or two stragglers to make up the fig leaf numbers. Andrew Marr said that Tony Blair stands much taller tonight, and that his opponents should now, in terms, slink away. Well, we didn't slink away, and never will. As long as God gives me breath, I shall fight for the justice for all those who lost their lives and their limbs and whose lives were destroyed, either as combatants on all sides, sent into a war, in our case, on a pack of lies, ill-clad, ill-armored, ill-equipped, ill-armed, and blinded by the light of Tony Blair's grisly smile. The Iraqi civilians, of course, are rarely mourned by the cheerleaders for the war, but more than 1 million of them have died. On top of all those who died in the sanctions which led up to the war, including 575,000 children, most of whom died before they even knew that they were Iraqis, but died for no other reason than that they were Iraqis. Madeleine Albright famously said that she considered all those dead children to be a price worth paying, which marks her as a criminal psychopath, but then we already knew that. What is important now is that those who made these grotesque blunders, these terrible disasters, this terrible crime, should never be forgotten. And so every time you see one of them on the screen, you should mentally recall the role that they played in the biggest foreign policy disaster in 100 years since the First World War, in my opinion. You should never listen to what they have to say without listening through the prism that this man or woman lied to me and lied 1 million people and more to their deaths. In the last conversation I had with Tony Blair in the library corridor of the House of Commons, outside the gentleman's lavatory to be precise, I told him that if you and Bush invade Iraq, the fall of Baghdad will come quickly. But the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, but merely the end of the beginning. I told Mr. Blair that there are no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but if you and Bush invade, there will be 100,000 Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they will spill out all over the world, and I said, including here inside this building. I told them that the Iraqi people would fight with their teeth if necessary, and for as long as necessary, until they had driven the occupation armies from their land. Everything I said was correct. And I'm just a secondary school educated former tire worker from a council house in Dundee. But I knew these things. And the Oxford Dons in the Foreign Office and at Foggy Bottom at the State Department of the United States, the Harvard Dons, they did not appear to know what I knew. Namely, that if you destroy the secular dictatorship in Iraq, the only possible outcome can be that Iraq will fall into the hands of Islamist forces of one stripe or another, either beholden to Iran, making Iraq effectively a province of Iran, or the fanatics of Al-Qaeda and what grew out of Al-Qaeda, a child even more hideous than Al-Qaeda, namely the Islamic State, ISIS, and its Saudi funders and ideological, theological fountainhead. If I knew that, how could they not have known that? One must assume, therefore, that they knew it and that they were committing what they knew to be a crime, but which they perhaps did not fully anticipate would also be a blunder almost as big as the crime. Because in the lifetime of the youngest person watching or listening to this, I bring you the melancholy news that the action which took place on this day in 2003 has not finished, and it will not finish in your whole lifetime, and perhaps in the lifetime of children yet unborn. As Talleyrand put it, it was a crime, yes, but it was worse than a crime. It was a blunder. Now, I was right about Iraq. Even the most churlish of my foes cannot deny that. I'm also right about this. My country of Scotland badly needs a time out from the fervid, swirling whirlpool of nationalist tension. A strategy of tension which has taken our country to the brink and maybe over the brink of lawlessness, of conspiracy, of incompetence on a scale never before seen in the annals of any devolved government anywhere in the world in all history, which I could spend the next 3 hours adumbrating to you. But it has also taken us over the brink into the language of potential civil war. I don't exaggerate. How can I? I had to bundle my wife and children into the back of a car on Friday and relocate them because a man, a soldier, a former soldier, a man who knew how to operate weapons, who knows, maybe even knew how to get weapons, threatened 3 times to shoot me in the head, to put a bullet in my brain, to give me a traitor's end. And then it emerged that 3 days previously, in almost identical language, he threatened to put a bullet in the brain of the Right Honourable Douglas Ross MP, the leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland. So I say to the state and its media, I say to Alex Massey and the Spectator, I say to Stephen Daisley and other state-inclined, conservative-inclined commentators who, notwithstanding the scars I am sustaining in the fight to keep Britain together, would rather attack me than attack the separatists and the nationalists. I say to them, it may not concern you that someone was going to put a bullet through my head. But if it doesn't concern you, that the same person was threatening to do the same to your leader, the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, then there's something far, far wrong with you. It's time for all the good people in Scotland, including those who want Scotland to be a separate country, to say this far and no further. The conspiracy to jail Alex Salmond, possibly for the rest of his life, is reason enough alone for a timeout from the SNP. But when you add what this nationalist project has succeeded in doing, in engendering hatred and racism of all kinds, today, just today, anti-Chinese racism, anti-Aboriginal racism, and of course the ever-present anti-English racism, on which this entire nationalist project is built. It's time for a timeout from the SNP. Shakespeare could have written this play. Macbeth is the one that comes closest to it. All the perfumes of Arabia will not expunge that damned spot, Nicola. That spot where you and your friends took decisions of such moment that how you must wish you could turn back the hands of time. I'm George Galloway. This is the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
Our world is full of mysteries. The lost city of Atlantis. Area 51. Who killed JFK? The clock on Dr. Ranjeet Brar's wall.
It's a conspiracy, man. We have a right to know.
Shut it, you nutter! The senseless made sensible. Only on the mother of all talk shows.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Now here's my first poll of the evening. In this time of partial lockdown, at least, though we are mercifully coming to an end of it, who should have the right to protest? A, groups we like, B, everyone, or C, no one. You can vote on my Twitter feed and also on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway. We'll be talking to Chris Williamson, the former Labour Member of Parliament, about the law which was passed this week in Parliament to severely circumscribe the right to protest. For example, outside Parliament in Parliament Square. And bear in mind that millions of us used the right to protest in the run-up to the Iraq war about which I spoke earlier. Are we really content quietly to go into that good night where we lay down our rights to protest, and will we ever get them back once we have laid them down? Now, this week, in what was undoubtedly the best piece of trolling ever by a world statesman, President Vladimir Putin of Russia urged President Joe Biden of the United States to have a live, televised conversation with him about the issues between the two countries, Russia and the United States of America. He added the postscript, let's not put this off for too long. I think I know what he meant. I'm certain that the coolest cat, the finest independent political commentator in the US, Garland Nixon, definitely will. Garland, welcome back on the mother of all talk shows.
Great to be back, George.
Now, it was an extraordinary episode. Talk us through it. What were the circumstances in which one world leader accused another world leader, both of them nuclear superpowers, of being a killer?
Well, basically, President Joe Biden was being interviewed by George Stephanopoulos. Now, the thing to know about George Stephanopoulos is that he was in the Clinton administration. He's a close confidant of the Clintons, and he was, of course, he's in the media now, and we see that's a dynamic that we see fairly regularly now, where political operatives or former CIA, FBI, et cetera, intelligence people are now part of the media. So he gave, I guess, what would be considered the question that all presidents have to answer. If you remember, Donald Trump was asked whether or not Vladimir Putin was a killer. And he gave an honest answer. And he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, we're no angels. Every world leader does things that are, a bit untoward. So it's not an issue. Now, Joe Biden took the opportunity to refer to President Putin as a killer, but I personally don't think that was the real meaty part of it. I don't think that was the most important part of it, because he also said he had no soul. And really, to say that a person is a killer is to talk about the actions that they take. To say that a person has no soul now is referring to a person as some kind of a savage, as a beast. If a person may be a killer, but you may be able to negotiate with a killer. But if a person has no soul, you're now implying that this person is some kind of a savage creature and that you cannot work out a deal with them. And keep in mind, most people know now that the U.S. regime change move is to start by demonizing the leader of the country, Assad, Maduro, whoever. They're a fiend, they're an evil beast, they can't be dealt with, and therefore the only option is to destroy them. And I think that was the really frightening and concerning part of President Biden's a particular comment, even though the part about him being a killer got the most got the most news coverage.
Now, I mean, what would people like Henry Kissinger have to say about that? I presume, at least in his mind, he'd say, well, all the US presidents have been killers too, but we have to negotiate with other leaders. And calling them killers on live television is probably not a wise thing to do. Were there any statesmen and women in the US that spoke up and said this was very unwise?
Well, we have had some members of Congress speak up and say that it was unwise. For the most part, the media here, I was surprised that it wasn't as widely covered as it should have been. I think that is an indicator. I think the fact that the U.S. media didn't really cover it like you would have thought is an indicator that they recognized that it was an error, and that people in power recognized the error of it. And the people outside of the U.S. should realize something. He wasn't talking to Vladimir Putin. He wasn't talking to the world stage, because on the world stage, that is a gross violation of diplomatic decorum, and everyone knows that. But he was talking to the regime change monsters in Washington, D.C. He was talking to the brain, in my opinion, the brainwashed cult that has become the Democratic Party. And it's very, very dangerous rhetoric. Particularly, we talk about it. There's been a lot of jokes about it. But the reality is these are the two nations that can wipe out all humanity in a matter of hours. So between that and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, going to Alaska, insulting the Chinese, talking down to them, condescendingly talking to them in the same way, I think it was two things. I think it was a horrific week for the Biden administration regarding international diplomacy, but I think that it was an eye-opening week for the rest of the world as to what they're going to have to deal with, which appears to me, and I am loath to say this, but it appears to me that the Biden administration may be considerably worse than the Trump administration when it comes to foreign policy.
Help me with this. The United States currently can't even pay its electricity bill. Entire states lose power. There are tens of millions unemployed in your country. There are tent cities. There is economic collapse. There is a pandemic raging. The United States is not in a position to effect regime change in Moscow or in Beijing. So what's the point of effectively declaring a kind of war against two countries that you're actually not going to be able to do anything about?
I think that the things that you've strung together that are internally falling apart, the internal problems that the U.S. has, is a reflection of the overall collapse. And I think that these absurd moves diplomatically, militarily, menacing China in the South China Sea and Russia in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, and throughout the Baltics and Eastern Europe, and God knows, the dangerous military buildup that's going on now in Ukraine all of this is an indicator of an empire that's in a precipitous collapse, wherein common people with common sense can look at the United States and say you should be looking internally and fixing your problems. You're falling apart, but the people at the top are acting as though everything's normal. I think part of what we're seeing is this: the Biden administration wanted to get this $1.9 trillion stimulus or relief package through. And once they got this through, we get into dangerous times because from their perspective, well, we've done what we need to do to address the pandemic. They don't really seem to recognize how broad the issues are. But now that we've done that, got that out of the way, this little bit of house cleaning and tidying up that we need to do, now we can address what we really want to do, which is, of course, rule the world. But they're trying to overthrow countries that are significantly more economically sound. I mean, the reality is, when it comes just to economic soundness, China and Russia are not in $70 trillion of debt like the United States and falling apart. But this is an indicator of the collapse. That's my point.
Whoever is all right, it isn't President Biden, as anyone who watches his presumably scripted and auto-cued remarks when he does appear. This is a man who looks like a ghost. And this week, he, presumably from an auto-cue, referred to President Harris. To what extent is that now the actuality?
Well, the bottom line, I think, too, is that both of these are people that the people in power, that the Silicon Valley oligarchs, the Wall Street oligarchs, et cetera, are happy. Remember, Wall Street celebrated. There were all kinds of articles in the New York Times about how happy they were that Kamala Harris was the vice president. They used to refer to Joe Biden as the credit card senator. So they're very happy right now with the pair that they have in there. They're going to do, that's the thing I think about it. They're going to do the things that they're told. You notice that some of the important phone calls, international diplomacy, Kamala Harris is handling because Joe Biden right now really is unable, it appears to me that he's unable to hold the kind of conversations. And this is a sad state of affairs. The president is unable to hold the kind of conversations that a leader of a nation this size would hold. But at any rate, I don't think either one of them are calling the shots. And I don't think most people in this country feel that either of them are calling the shots. So they're kind of interchangeable.
He fell several times going up the steps to the aircraft. One begins to think it is verging on elder abuse to put him through this kind of thing. How is Trump doing? What is Trump doing?
So Donald Trump is still, they kind of shut him down on Twitter, but Donald Trump is still, to be quite honest, showing that he is in charge of the Republican Party, that he is the power of the Republican Party. The reality is, if there were primaries today, Donald Trump would probably win them handily and easily. And I believe that the Democratic Party and their, the powers behind them, particularly the intelligence community, are trying to figure a way to stop Donald Trump from running again if he's in good health. Because right now he seems to know what is going on and he's making noise. And the reality is that if Biden continues the way he's going, and he probably won't make 2 years. And I'll add this: all of the stumbling and bumbling, tripping, falling down the stairs, unable to account for himself verbally, puts Joe Biden in a position where he knows this at any given time that he stops going along with what his handlers want. All they have to say is, well, it's time for Joe Biden to step down because he cannot handle he's not up to handling the mentally and physically, he's not up to handling the job anymore. So he is an extremely weak president, and I think his handlers are happy about him being in this position because that gives them even more leverage over him. But Donald Trump is still hanging around. He's still beloved by about 80 or 90% of Republicans, and he is still a thorn in the side of the Democrats. And I'll add this, and a lot of people are still comparing Trump. They're looking at the stimulus bill and saying, wait a minute, you gave us less money than Donald Trump. Wait a minute, Donald Trump tried to bring the troops home from Afghanistan and Syria, and you guys stopped them. So they're kind of making Donald Trump's points. Sadly for them, I'm a lefty. I was a Bernie or a Corbyn kind of guy, so I'm no Trump supporter. But they're making the point that Donald Trump was not as dangerous as Joe Biden right now. So I think America's looking at what's going on, and Donald Trump could be back in the mix at some point.
So you don't expect Joe Biden to take Putin's offer of a live televised conversation between them? You don't expect him to take it up anytime soon?
Well, to be quite honest, and I think most people recognize it, I don't think it was a real offer. It would be like me, walking up to someone who, had two broken legs and said, hey, let's run 100 yards. I'm a 100-yard dash. We both know they can't. I'm just reminding everybody that they can't run because their legs are broken. And I think what Vladimir Putin was doing was just reminding the world, this guy is not up to this task. So I'm going to ask him to do something that we all know that he can't do. So it was kind of he threw him an elbow to the ribs, kind of subtly, and with a smirk on his face.
Thank you very much indeed, as always, Garland Nixon, for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Now, my Telegram channel is t.me/George Galloway. You can vote on the poll on that. My shop, by the way, is www.georgegalloway.shop. Some great offers on there at the moment. But you can vote also on my Twitter feed. And here's how it's going. In this time, at this point in time, who should have the right to protest? A, groups we like. 3% people were honest enough to vote for that. B, everyone, 88%. And C, no one at all, 9%. Get voting, if you will, on my Twitter feed or on my Telegram channel. Let me take a 2-minute break while we show you something in relation to the Facebook France 2 affair.
Radio Sputnik.
Hello, listeners and viewers of the mother of all talk shows. This is the real George Galloway, and most definitely not an AI deep fake. Now, just like our segment, This Is the Week, let me begin with things I'd never say. Here's a cracker. I read the Daily Mail every single morning over my breakfast. The crosswords are indeed my favourite. I was never a member of Parliament. In fact, I've never even voted. I don't like wearing hats. I'm more of a headband kind of man. Don't believe me? Look at how I push my glasses on my face as I make a point. How I use my hands to emphasize it further, and you know I'm really angry when I go quiet. I'll continue. Nicola Sturgeon is my favourite member of the Crankies, and I'm most definitely not a deep fake. You get me?
This version of George Galloway is the property of France 2 and was not meant for broadcast. Je suis désolé.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Thanks for all your social media commentary. Colin says everyone should have the right to peacefully protest. It goes hand in hand with free speech and freedom of choice in a democracy. Mel says everyone should be allowed to peacefully protest. The issues start when violent behaviour does. And Pamela says, dependent on when they protest, they should adhere to COVID regulations at present. Tim says, you can protest all you want when the majority of the population is so brainwashed that it doesn't even matter. And Clive says everyone should have the right, but that doesn't mean you have the right to cause criminal damage or attack people. If that happens, then they should not moan if they receive a thump. And Jonathan says everyone has the right to protest, and arguably everyone should at some point in their life. Yet people should not protest recklessly in the current environment. And we need proper police accountability over protests. Danny says everyone has the right to protest, but unfortunately the media will paint them as they see fit. Now, Chris Williamson, former Labour Member of Parliament, a man who's regularly been my guest on the mother of all talk shows and indeed on my television show Sputnik, is up in arms at the encroachments on civil liberties that have now apparently become so routine that very few people are ready to stand up to them. Not amongst our audience. That's going pretty well, actually. But in the general public, led by the mass media, all it needs is a bit of COVID shroud waving, and people are quite content, it seems, to go into the good night of a liberty-free society. Let's hear from Chris, former Labour Member of Parliament for Derby North. Chris, thanks for joining us. What did you make of the new bill?
Well, I think it drives a coach and horses through the European Convention on Human Rights, which enshrines the right to freedom of assembly. And it's incredibly troubling, I think, because what it will do is put immense powers in the hands of the authorities to clamp down on protests and subject people who are engaged in a lawful demonstration to a criminal sanction. And, you know, I mean, the right to protest has been a feature of Britain, and it's one of the things I think that Britain likes to pride itself on, its right to that freedom of assembly. And if you think about it, you know, most of, not all of the social progress that we've ever brought about in this country has started out with public protest, whether you be looking at universal suffrage, the opposition to the rise of the far right, particularly in the 1970s, with the establishment of the Anti-Nazi League, the Bristol bus boycott, and the organisations like the anti-blood sports movement, which culminated in getting hunting banned by law, have all been a feature of their campaigns as being, public protest. And what this now does is, if it is deemed to inconvenience somebody or people feel irritated by the protest, then they will have the right to make a complaint, and that could then be or result in people being subject to those criminal sanctions. So this is very, very worrying, and I think coming as well hot on the heels of the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, which it is now, Criminal Conduct Act, which gives the right to the security services and the police to commit criminal conduct, to commit crimes, up to and including, it seems, there is no restriction, rape, torture and murder. And the sort of circumstances which it says on the face of the bill where that criminal conduct would be permitted would be, lists a number of things, but one of them is if it's deemed to be in the interest of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom. Well, obviously the idea of what is in the economic in the interest of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom for the current government is very different to your view and my view, I think, George. And, those of us that perhaps would want to protest about that, could be subject to these, well, absolutely sort of draconian powers, which are now being actually put in the hands of the security services and the.
Keir Starmer must have been up in arms at that last one, the one you've just been describing, the powers that it gives to the James Bonds or Austin Powers next door and across the river to actually kill people, as long as it's in the economic interests of the United Kingdom. Keir Starmer must have had a fit about that one.
Well, if only. And it's yet another example of his absolute failure to oppose this dreadful government. And members of the Labour Party in Parliament were whipped to abstain on the legislation. So no, I mean, they did put down some amendments, to be fair, to explicitly exclude rape, torture, and murder, and they were defeated. So that's why I say it's not a case of hyperbole on my part. There was an attempt to say, well, okay, you want to push this legislation through, but criminal conduct must not include rape, torture, or murder, and that was voted down. So all bets are off. Really, it seems anything is possible now for the security services and police to act on behalf of the state as they see fit. I mean, and it's incredibly
Kafka.
Worrying, really,
Kafka couldn't have written that one. Now we can't avoid this, Chris. The Labour Party, it was said, would be 20 points ahead in the public opinion polls if only they could get rid of that nasty Mr. Corbyn. What happened next?
Well, as you know, George, I mean, we saw Starmer being installed as the leader after 4 or 5 years of direct sabotage from the very senior levels in the party to undermine Corbyn's leadership. And, one of the chief architects of that sabotage, of course, was Sir Keir Starmer, who pushed for the second referendum on the European Union, knowing full well that would play incredibly badly, as it did in many Labour heartland seats, and led directly, I think, to Labour losing that election. And here we are now with this abject government, and they're still trailing woefully in the opinion polls. I mean, look, people have just, they're just fed up. I mean, there is no real choice now between the major political parties, and I think people are just giving up. And I think what we'll see at the local elections coming up and subsequent elections, unless there's some radical realignment in the political parties in Britain, a huge abstention at the polls, to an even greater extent than we normally see. I mean, we know that in every election, the biggest cohort are the non-voters. I think it was something like 15.6 million people didn't vote in the last general election. I think the Tories got in with something in the order of 13.5 million. I don't know the precise figure. But I suspect that non-voting figure will go through the roof. And that, together with other measures, of course, which the government has been pushing to make it more difficult for people to vote, to make it more difficult for people to register to vote. I mean, it's straight out of the Republicans' playbook in the United States of America to try and disenfranchise people. So that with that disenfranchisement, with the kind of, no real kind of alternative on offer, I think the cynicism with politics is going to grow. And that's why I... along with others, have established the Resist movement for a People's Party to try and build an alternative social movement in this country to encourage people to recognise the power that's in their hands, the power of solidarity. That's all we have as ordinary working class people. That's all we've got is each other. And if we link arms and stand together, then we are very, very powerful. And we need, I think, to raise people's expectations and raise political consciousness to encourage people to recognise, what is possible, what these institutions of the state, what these instruments of the state can actually and should actually be doing for them, but also to recognise what people can do by standing together. As our, pioneers of the Labour movement and the cooperative movement over 100 years ago, when they stood together to get better conditions at work. And, the cooperative movement banded together, as we know, to ensure that, working class people had access to, good quality food and other services which were denied them. So I think we could take inspiration from those pioneers and remember that, the political duopoly that held sway up until 120 years ago between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party was broken by the Labour Party. But we're back in that situation now where there's no real difference between the major parties. And so I think a realignment is desperately required, but we've got to find a way of, that is, when I say we, those of us on the left, we've got to find a way where we can collaborate and work together and not just put all our eggs in an electoral strategy. We need to build that social movement, because without that social movement, I think any electoral strategy will be doomed to fail.
Yes, although not many, or at least the vast majority of Labour members have not yet so concluded. The trade unions are still giving them millions of pounds, even though, at least Dick Turpin wore a mask. The Labour front bench are taking union money and betraying union members, hand over fist. Precisely none of the Labour members of Parliament have resigned in protest to go and sit beside their former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who still sits alone as an independent MP, kicked out by Keir Starmer from the Parliamentary Labour Party. And most Labour Party members, for one reason or another, are sticking with it. Are they wise to do so?
No, I don't think they are, but there is a real affinity with the Labour Party. I stuck with the party for 44 years. I think you were a member yourself, George, for 30 years or so, weren't you? So I think there is that. It's a sense of, it's almost like a family in a way, and this is quite a break. It's quite a wrench to leave the party, but there is no means. I think we've had this discussion previously, George, where there is no means available now to party members to wrest control of the party. It's stitched up. The Parliamentary Labour Party is out of control. The bureaucracy is, as we know, an institution inside the party that's been used to undermine the previous leader and continues to target socialists and anti-imperialists inside the party for suspension and expulsion. And the National Executive Committee is a undemocratic body. Most of the members are appointed by the leader and various trade union general secretaries, not elected by the trade union members. And only 25% of the seats on the National Executive Committee are elected by the party membership. So, I think I understand why that's affinity with the party, but really when the situation is so bad, when it's so clear that socialists are not welcome in the party, and when you have a party which is the flip side of the establishment coin, it's the Tory party Mark II, I think, we do need to look at a different way forward. And I think on that basis, it's important that people get involved in alternative movements out there. We've established the Resist Movement for a People's Party, the Workers' Party that you are involved with, George. There are a number of options out there, the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition, as well as others. And I think one of the things I'm hoping anyway is that we can do, as I've already said, is to try and bring those forces together. But, there's about 100,000 people have left the Labour Party, and I suspect that number is going to increase. A lot of people maybe have not made the actual decision to resign, although a substantial number have. But many others, and this is anecdotal, but it seems to be borne out by the figures, are saying they're just simply not going to renew their subscription. What I think the challenge is going to be, though, for those of us on the progressive left in this country, is to ensure that that energy, that hope and that optimism that was encapsulated by the Corbyn movement isn't completely dissipated. And we need to, give people hope, give people a new home and a new purpose, really, to their interest in the transformation of the country, which obviously did encourage so many people to join the Labour Party. Obviously, they were sadly disappointed by what they found, but I think that that twin track approach of building a social movement and having a political strategy too will enable us to bring about change, and will encourage new working class leaders to come through and to put themselves up for election. But as I say, there's a big process of political education to be done, and to encourage people across the country to, as I've already said, recognise the strength of their solidarity and to actually alert people to, what are the possibilities, what can be done, what can be done at local government level right now, for example. Let's start there. There are many things that local authorities can do, notwithstanding the cuts that they've been imposed upon them by this government, and there's no doubt about that. But there are changes in legislation, which ironically the Tories brought about, which does then enable them to get around some of those cuts by asking the rich people in each borough to pay substantially more and to protect everybody else by freezing or even reducing potentially their council tax, to stop the Tory cuts, and then to have a conversation with people about where they want to see improvements. It would require a referendum. The legislation does require, in those circumstances, a referendum. But I think, that would be a good way of engaging with people and asking for their opinion and encouraging people to participate in civic life in that way. And then I think you're getting then towards a much more of a different type of democratic model, something I'm very keen for us to build, and that is a participatory democratic model rather than the representative democratic model that we have at the moment, because the representatives don't represent the people in reality. If they did, as I always keep saying, we wouldn't have 14 million people living in poverty. It seems they're more interested in representing the interests of the corporate capitalists and the very wealthy elites.
Now, what about Corbyn, Chris? Just we've only a couple of minutes left. You were extremely loyal to him. Fat lot of good it did you. I was pretty loyal to him myself, and ditto. Does he just, wither on the vine as an independent? Is there any serious movement to at least even get him back as a Labour MP? It's a very strange situation. The man that just a year ago was the leader of the Labour Party is now effectively out of it, but sitting in Parliament as an independent.
I don't think there's any way back for Jeremy in the Labour Party. Starmer's set his stall out very clearly, and he's not going to let Jeremy back, irrespective of what the membership or the National Executive Committee say. I mean, let's remember the National Executive Committee panel looked at Jeremy's case and reinstated him, and then Starmer said, well, that's fine, but you're not going to be able to rejoin the Parliamentary Labour Party, and withdrew the whip or refused to restore the whip. So I think Jeremy, I know he set up the Peace and Justice Project, but I think it would be good if Jeremy were to, join with those of us who are trying to build an alternative movement, a social movement, and an alternative electoral strategy, because that would be a really powerful signal, I think, and would give give Jeremy a real purpose. Because at the minute he's as you say, he's isolated. The Socialist Campaign Group is, well, they're not really worth very much, I've got to say. I regret. I mean, they're not
doing much campaigning for him.
Well, virtually none. I mean, there are a substantial number of them actually were highly critical of him and refused to even sign the mealy-mouthed statement that the campaign group put out in support of Jeremy. Look, if they were serious about supporting him, they should have all withdrawn, all resigned the whip, or given Starmer an ultimatum that you either restore the whip to Jeremy or we're resigning the whip collectively within 24 hours. And I think the trade union leaders similarly should have said, we're going to start the process to defund and disaffiliate unless you reinstate Jeremy. I mean, I know that the Bakers Union have started the process and consulting with members about whether to remain affiliated to the Labour Party. But unless there's any threat, follow through, then it's just empty words. And, I think the trade union movement the trade union leadership, that is, need a long, hard look at themselves and what the Labour Party in Parliament is actually offering. The Labour Party in Parliament is no longer the political voice of the organised working class. It's very, very clear. And then, they're getting very, very poor value for money. And they're not serving their members' interests, it seems to me, by continuing to bankroll the Labour Party. They'd be far better, actually, supporting grassroots activity and supporting political engagement and consciousness raising around the country. Because that's the way it seems to me. And we look at the examples, and I know you're very familiar with the situation in Latin America, George, but I mean, look at what happened in Bolivia. I mean, incredible what they achieved, a US-backed coup, and within 12 months against Evo Morales, and within 12 months, the movement towards socialism were back in power. They forced new elections. But that's because they had a social movement. And that's where I think and that was the trade unions and civil society working together in Bolivia. We could learn a lot from Latin America, and I hope that the trade union leadership will look at that and use that as a model, as a way forward.
Chris Williamson, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Chris Williamson, former Labour MP. The poll is, who should have the right to protest at this time? Groups we like, 3%. Everyone, 88%. No one, 9%. Stayed actually completely stable, that poll. You've still got an hour in which to influence it. But let me go to the news with Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The United Kingdom has seen a third consecutive day with a record number of COVID vaccinations after 873,784 people received a jab over 24 hours. NHS England revealed during 1 hour on Saturday jabs were given at a rate of 26 a second. NHS Chief Executive Sir Simon Stevens said, "In just one day, we vaccinated the equivalent of the entire adult populations of Liverpool, Southampton and Oxford combined." Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the figure, tweeting, "A huge thank you to everyone involved, and please come forward to get your jab when you are invited to do so." The figure equates to roughly 1.3% of the UK population receiving a vaccination in the last 24 hours and means more than 2.24 million people have received a jab in the last 3 days. The European Union should not build walls around the distribution of vaccines and should seek to meet its contractual obligations, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said. His comments follow a threat by the European Commission to block vaccine exports to countries including the UK. EU Commissioner Mairead McGuinness said all sides needed to calm down. Buckingham Palace is set to review its diversity policies across all royal households. The work will look at improving diversity at Buckingham Palace, Clarence House and Kensington Palace. Royal sources have stressed that the palace already has policies, procedures and programmes in place, but has not seen the progress it would like. The work began, sources claimed, before the Duke and Duchess of Sussex made allegations of racism within the royal family. Prince Harry and Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey included claims that they had been asked how dark their son's skin would be before his birth. The boss of Australian airline Qantas has said that governments are going to insist on vaccines for international travellers. Coronavirus vaccines are seen as crucial to reviving an industry that saw worldwide passenger numbers fall 75.6% last year. Chief Executive Alan Joyce said many governments were talking about vaccinations a condition of entry. Even if they weren't, he said, he believed the airline should enforce its own policy. Millions of people around the world have celebrated Nowruz, a festival that marks the Persian New Year and the official beginning of spring. Nowruz begins at the spring equinox when the sun crosses the equator and day and night are equal length. It's mainly celebrated in Iran, Afghanistan and the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Turkey, as well as parasists in India and diaspora communities around the rest of the world. This year, which in the Persian calendar is the year 1400s, celebrations in many places have had to take place amid coronavirus restrictions. The leading opposition candidate in Congo-Brazzaville's presidential election is in hospital with COVID-19 while voting is underway. In a video circulating on social media, 61-year-old Guy Bryce Parfait Colilas is seen briefly removing an oxygen mask to tell his supporters that he is fighting death. He urges them to vote in the election. President Denis Sassou Nguesso, who is widely seen as an authoritarian ruler, is expected to win again. Turkey has pulled out of an international accord designed to protect women from domestic violence. President Erdogan has annulled Turkey's ratification of the Istanbul Convention 10 years after it was the first country to sign the landmark European treaty. No reason was given for the withdrawal, but top government officials said Turkey's domestic law would protect women's rights instead. A visitor at the San Diego Zoo was arrested on Friday shortly after taking his 2-year-old daughter into an elephant enclosure, according to the San Diego Police Department. Jose Navarrete made it into the elephant enclosures with his daughter after passing multiple barriers. Once the father and daughter were inside the enclosure, an elephant noticed the pair and started to trot towards them. When Navarrete tried to exit the enclosure with his 2-year-old, he dropped her but was able to pick her up. He is booked into the San Diego County Jail, according to police, and he is charged with child cruelty and is currently being held on a $100,000 bail. And finally, the Hollywood actor Seth Rogen, who's been in several stoner comedies, has launched his cannabis lifestyle brand called Houseplant in the United States. Together with screenwriter Evan Goldberg, he sets sights on the burgeoning cannabis market. Houseplant's goods include ashtrays and lighters shipping across the country, together with strains of cannabis available for delivery in California, where consumption is legal. Their co-founders include producers James Weaver and Alex McAtee, as well as venture investor Michael Moore, who is heading Houseplant as CEO. It comes just 2 years after Houseplant debuted in Canada. There is a growing momentum to legalize cannabis use across the United States. In November, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota joined 11 other states, as well as Washington, D.C., in approving its recreational use and sales. And New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo has signaled his intention to do the same. The legal cannabis industry is projected to be worth $41.5 billion by 2025. And while it's often asserted by advocates that cannabis is safer than alcohol consumption, a 2020 study showed that today's increasingly potent strains are linked with greater risks of addiction, anxiety, and psychosis. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Okay, the lines are open. We're taking your calls. If you're in the UK, 02077 982 255. That's 02077 982 255. If you're in the US, it's 001 757 744 4480. Or you can tweet us, of course, at George Galloway at RT UK News. Now, as Garland Nixon was pointing out, Blinken, the US Secretary of State, went to Alaska and heaped insults on the government of China, the ruling party in China, insults that will not be lightly forgotten. The backdrop, of course, is not only the 2 years at least of absolute belligerence from former President Trump towards China, hyped by the coronavirus 14 or 15 months ago, but also increasing attacks in the United States on Asian people who may or may not be Chinese, or who may, like my own wife, often be thought to look Chinese, or my own children who speak Chinese because they want to and because they attend Chinese school. Anyone sensible would want to know China better, would want to have better relations with China. And even if there were political or economic differences, would prefer that they were conducted in a civilized manner. Not the United States, not Trump, not Biden, not the oaf, the soprano character, mafia don that was Trump's Secretary of State, nor the more esoteric Secretary of State of Joe Biden. New boss, much like the old boss, at least so far as China and Asia is concerned. Now, Tom Fowdy is a man I've been following in print for a long time, but only recently got the opportunity to meet him on screen. He's a very, very impressive young man. And there's nothing he doesn't know about China, about the Far East, and about the West relationship to it. So I'm glad to say Tom Fowdy joins us now on the mother of all talk shows. Tom, thanks for
George,
coming
it's a pleasure to be here.
On board. Thank you. Let me start with the Alaska brouhaha. Why did the US go there to insult China?
Well, that's a very good question. The United States said to China, we want to talk. And then they proceeded to present China with a laundry list of insults and grievances, including sanctions on 24 officials for the electoral reform in Hong Kong. You know, China described the event themselves as a strategic dialogue, but the US says this isn't a strategic dialogue. You know, that makes us wonder just what exactly did the US want? And I think it comes down to two things. I think behind the scenes, you know, the American politicians are very much aware that the United States needs stability and some degree of positivity in its relationship with China. They are the two world's largest economies. Whether they like it or not, they are deeply integrated. But in America, the domestic political environment has become so toxic and so hostile that the US administration don't have any choice but to present this meeting in wholly antagonistic terms. Because if they don't, you're going to have the Republicans on their back saying they're capitulating to China, Beijing, Biden. There is no political space to publicize a positive relationship with Beijing because the hatred for China in American politics has become so deep, bipartisan, and structurally entrenched. But they know behind the scenes that they have to talk. So they present the meeting in a very belligerent way. They try to talk down to China. They try to make it look tough. But I think when you get to the actual dialogue behind the scenes, perhaps it might be a bit more amicable, even though the strategic interests of the two countries are indeed very far apart, and I don't think that's going to change.
Now, when you say integrated, China holds more US dollars in treasury bills and cash than the United States has. Many of the biggest companies in the United States have moved lock, stock, and barrel, much of their production to China. The Chinese economy is breathing down the neck of the American economy for the top dog status. It might be this year, it might be next, it might be the one after that, but in the foreseeable future, China's economy will overtake the United States. It's similar to what I asked Garland Nixon earlier. Who in their right mind would decide to have belligerent relations with such an economic superpower if you didn't have to, if there were no actual, real state differences between them, and there aren't. China's not taking anything from the United States. China's not sailing its warships outside San Francisco Bay. It's the other way around. What's the thinking behind the U.S. hostility?
Absolutely. And as you say, you know, given the potential of China's economy and that it continues to be an engine of world growth, the idea of this so-called decoupling that countries in the West, most especially the US, should rely less on China, you know, it's absolute insanity. And it all boils down to the fact that the United States have a problem with a rising China on its own terms. So the United States had premised their policy of opening up an engagement with China after Mao Zedong met with Richard Nixon in Beijing in 1972. And they believed back then that American integration, investment, and trade with China's economy would develop China into their image, that it would democratize China, that it would create, you know, a bonanza for American interests, that it would transform them into their ideological vision. And, you know, this was also rooted in the exceptionalism which came after America's victory in the Cold War. However, as China has developed and become the world's second largest economy and is steering towards the top and is making advances in critical technologies, the revelation has emerged amongst the US foreign policy elite that China is not transforming into what they hoped it would be. You know, engagement with China was conditional on the fact that China would adapt to their terms and conditions, and it has not. It's took its own path. And quite rightly, it's a very successful path as well. And so the American policy has changed towards trying to forcefully contain China and trying to use, means such as sanctions, decoupling, geopolitical confrontation to try and make the China which they desire by force. They've always had a big interest in China's domestic market. But they have a problem with the Chinese state in the fact that that market is geared towards the interests of China more so than American companies have an unbridled dominance about it. That's why they have a lot of complaints about so-called state subsidies, and they use rhetoric such as open up, because they want to be able to economically exploit China, just like the empires of old and the British did. So they try to force political and ideological opening to China and subjugate it so it can be one way in their benefit. And that's why they don't want emerging technology giants such as Huawei, for example, because it threatens American monopolies in these sectors around the world, and it in turn threatens America's hegemony in a strategic sense. So it's all about trying to hammer China back down and exploit it on their own premise and try to impose their own vision on China, as opposed to China doing what's basically in its best interests of development.
Well, good luck with that. Finally, there's a whole range of pieces in this orchestra of protest, a cat's chorus about China. One day it's Tibet, the next day it's Uyghurs, then it's the South China Sea, then it's Taiwan, then it's Huawei, then it's coronavirus. But the latest is the military coup in Myanmar. Why is China getting the blame for that one?
Well, first of all, China has nothing to do with the events on the ground in Myanmar. And in fact, China actually prefers, a stable Myanmar and didn't actually have any problem with the democratic regime which was in before it. However, to answer your question, Myanmar is a strategic part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It is very close to China in geopolitical terms, and its geography connected to China's southwestern region allows China to access the Indian Ocean and bypass the Strait of Malacca, which it's building transport infrastructure and other energy infrastructure, which weakens the ability of the United States Navy to try and militarily contain China in the area around its periphery in the South China Sea. So there's a concerted effort going on right now to try and scapegoat China for the events on the ground in Myanmar, and also to stir up anti-China unrest in Myanmar to try and make the situation a catastrophe for Beijing, making it culpable and also convincing Myanmar's population that the political disruption in their country is to blame by Beijing. So there's very much a geopolitical...
He's frozen. What a great pity. Well, thanks for that anyway, Tom. Very fascinating. I think we'll have to return to the Myanmar issue in due course. Now, let me go back to the social media. David says, will you be having a showdown with the SNP on Question Time? Thank you, David, for your kind words. I won't read them out. But yes, I very much hope so. And Paul says, the reason why right-wing commentators are attacking you is because this arrangement between the Tories and the SNP as dominant forces in both countries suits both sides. You are a threat to that arrangement. Go get them. Thanks, Paul. And Jennifer says, many SNP supporters claim that the party isn't racist. How would they like to explain why members of the party find it acceptable to tell my father, who is English but has lived in Scotland for over 50 years, to F off back to England. It's very shameful, Jennifer, but they even say it to me, and I'm not English. I was born and bred and educated and worked in Scotland. I represented Glasgow constituency for 15 years in the Westminster Parliament. I have the closest possible relations with Scotland, even when I didn't live there. My mother lives there, my sister lives there, my brother lives there. The idea that someone like me can be told to F off back to England, never mind your dear father, who 50 years has lived in Scotland but can be insulted in this way. And that's where nationalism ends up. All nationalisms end up that way. A nationalism in a democratic country where there is no oppression of any part of the United Kingdom. In fact, the opposite is true. The Scottish people are given more from the Treasury than any other in England and Wales. The opposite of oppression is true in Scotland. Yet the fantasy of seeing themselves as somehow an oppressed people is completely prevalent and is driving much of this racism. Let me take a quick break and then I'll be back with That Was the Week.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Comrade, tired of being trapped in mainstream media? Join the revolution with mother of all talk shows. Has been instrumental in making brain and heart of people stronger, like kettlebell for mind. Don't be brainwashed, CC, an open mind to new way of thinking. If you don't know how, George will teach you. If you won't learn, he will make you. Speak to Comrade Galloway if you think you're hard enough on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Well, violent and dramatic events in Bristol will try and bring you more details, maybe some Rupley pictures on that later in the show. Police stations on fire, police vans on fire, violent protest, which is opposite, you could say, to the poll that we are running at the moment. Who should have the right to protest in the current climate? But first, this is the spot where I look back at the 7 days which shaped our present and no doubt our future. This is the week. This day, as I said earlier, in 2003, missiles and bombs were raining down on Baghdad, and innocent people, sometimes called collateral damage by those firing the weapons. And we were in the early hours of the catastrophic war on Iraq. Everyone knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. At least the people knew. Millions throughout the world had marched in protest against it. But Tony Blair and George Bush ignored them. And of course, as I predicted, it has given rise to Islamist terror throughout not just the Middle East, but also onto our own streets. On this day in 1960, South African police opened fire on a peaceful protest in the South African township of Sharpeville, murdering 69 people and wounding 180 more. Eyewitnesses said men, women and children fled like rabbits as up to 300 officers began randomly shooting into a 5,000-strong crowd outside the municipal offices in Sharpeville. Police in armoured vehicles opened fire indiscriminately, claiming later that some of the protesters had been stone throwing. It was the Sharpeville massacre, one of the most notorious but significant incidents in South Africa's long fight against apartheid. In the following days, 77 Africans, many of them still in hospital, were arrested for questioning. This was also the day in 1961 that the Beatles first appeared at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. And this was also the week in 1963 that Britain's Secretary of State for War, John Profumo, denied any hanky-panky with the model, Christine Keeler. Allegations were made by 3 members of Parliament in the Commons that Profumo was connected to the disappearance of Keeler, who was due to appear as a witness in a trial at the Old Bailey. But in a personal statement to the House, 48-year-old Profumo very, very pompously and categorically denied the accusations. He warned he wouldn't hesitate to issue writs for libel and slander if these allegations were made outside the House of Commons. Empty threats, of course, because on the 5th of June, Profumo resigned from the government after admitting he had lied to Parliament about his relationship with Christine Keeler, which was, of course, sexual. He did have sex with that woman. Now, if only John Profumo's morals were present in the Holyrood Parliament in Edinburgh and the Westminster Parliament in London, if only people who admitted lying to the Parliament resigned, perhaps we'd be a better country. Anyway, the British ambassador in Holland, Sir Richard Sykes, was shot dead in 1979 outside his Dutch home. 2 IRA gunmen opened fire on him and his Dutch footman as they left his residence at The Hague to make the short 5-minute car journey to the embassy. It was in this week in 1965 that US confirmed its troops used chemical warfare against the people of Vietnam. Agent Orange, mainly, a toxic defoliant, napalm, of course, as well as carpet bombing the country for good measure. President Ronald Reagan unveiled plans to combat nuclear war in space this week in 1983. Remember that? The Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars, proposed a defensive shield using laser or particle beam technology to intercept and destroy incoming missiles as they traveled through the stars. The increasing financial strain that this placed on the Soviet Union in responding to it contributed to the breakup of the USSR. Star Wars was then abandoned promptly in 1993. An oil tanker ran aground on a reef off the Alaskan coast, releasing millions of gallons of crude oil into the sea this week in 1989. The Exxon Valdez got into trouble in Prince William Sound when it hit Bligh Reef, splitting its side open and releasing oil with initial reports of an 8-mile slick. In 2004, a federal judge in Alaska ordered Exxon to pay $4.5 billion in damages for the Valdez oil spill, the largest in US history. However, it emerged that the Exxon Valdez had actually dumped 11 million US gallons of crude oil and contaminated about 1,300 miles of coastline. 250,000 seabirds, 3,000 sea otters, 300 harbour seals, 250 bald eagles, and up to 22 killer whales died as a result of the spill. Speaking of spill, the Exxon captain admitted drinking vodka before boarding the vessel, but was subsequently acquitted of operating a ship while intoxicated. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia died after a gun attack in Riyadh in 1975. He was rushed to hospital still alive, with doctors massaging his heart, who gave him a blood transfusion but were unable to save him. King Faisal was fatally wounded when his nephew fired 3 bullets at him with a pistol at point-blank range during a royal audience. The prince was later found guilty of regicide and in June 1975, he was executed for the murder of his uncle. The prince was beheaded in the public square in Riyadh, the traditional method of execution in Saudi Arabia. Israel and Egypt ended 30 years of war in this week in 1979 with an historic treaty brokered by the United States, Jimmy Carter. The ceremony on the White House lawn in Washington was broadcast live on television. The two leaders sealed the deal with a handshake, watched by a smiling President Jimmy Carter. President Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize later that year. Under the Accords, Israel agreed to withdraw troops from the Sinai Peninsula in return for Egypt's recognition of the State of Israel. Not much was given to the Palestinian people, but President Sadat died for this decision to shake hands with Israel at the hands of extremists in the Egyptian army opposed to the treaty. In 1971, Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan, declared its independence from the rest of Pakistan. And in 1981, the Gang of Four, otherwise known as the SDP, the Social Democrats, launched their new political party, pledging to reconcile the nation and heal divisions between classes. How did that work out? The gang were four Labour defectors. They were Roy Jenkins, whom I got to know quite well when I dumped his well-upholstered backside out of the House of Commons with my victory in Glasgow Hillhead in 1987. And former Labour cabinet ministers David Owen, William Rogers, whom no one remembers at all, and Mrs. Shirley Williams. The world's worst aviation disaster occurred in this week in 1977. And I'm afraid to tell you I had forgotten it. More than 580 people died when two jumbo jets collided on a runway in the holiday destination of Tenerife. This photo is the reconstruction of the moment of impact. The final total was 583, all dying in the blaze that followed this collision. The KLM Jumbo, preparing for takeoff, clipped the Pan Am plane, which was taxiing across the runway. Ultimately, the crash was blamed on the KLM pilot. In 1980, another appalling disaster occurred, one which I remember only too well, when 123 oil rig workers died after a North Sea accommodation platform collapsed during gales. It was hit by a massive wave on one of the legs of the platform, the Alexander Keeland, causing it to break and send 208 people tumbling into the sea. And finally, on a much happier note, this was the week in 1952 that the classic musical comedy Singin' in the Rain premiered in New York. It featured Gene Kelly and Debbie Reynolds and is a Christmas TV staple to this day. That's it. Another 7 days, good, the bad, and the ugly in our past. That was the week that was. And this is Peter in Birmingham with our first call of the evening. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you very much, George, for having me on the show. My point is that we are commemorating, alas, the disastrous events which happened with the Iraq War. And my point is that Britain needs to have a war crimes tribunal. If we do not have this, then I fear that in another decade we'll be commemorating a potential war in Iran and also one in Syria. And the people, not just Tony Blair, but the whole machinery, the whole war machinery needs to be held into account, because that machinery will just continue doing these illegal wars forever unless they're held to account.
Well, perfectly put, Peter. As I put it, lying your country into war must have morally consequences. There must be moral hazard for deliberately lying your people, your armed forces, into a disastrous war. for moral reasons, but you've highlighted the other reason, the practical reason, that if no one is held accountable for a crime, for a blunder of this magnitude, then nothing exists to stop other people doing the same again. As a matter of fact, since the Iraq War, we have done it again, with the same cat's chorus of journalists and broadcasters talking us into one war after another since the disaster of Iraq. They've learned nothing, forgotten nothing, and the politicians have, far from being deterred by the disaster of Iraq, have done the same thing over and over again. You are well aware of what they did in Libya, the anniversary of which was yesterday, where they transformed the richest country in Africa into 5 countries, at least, with no government, no army, no borders, no boundaries, no state power, but a multitude of local warlord powers. They destroyed the secular dictator Gaddafi, and just like in Iraq, the only people who could possibly profit from that were the myriad of Islamist fanatic, head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart-eating militias. And that's exactly what has happened. So if you don't have accountability for crimes and blunders of this magnitude, then nothing will stop future leaders committing the same crimes, the same blunders, all over again. Peter, thanks for the call. John is in South Shields. Go ahead, John.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Perfect. Mr. Galloway, I've been an admirer of you for many years, primarily for your oratory skills, but also for your positions politically. Getting that aside, you seem to stride on the divide of social liberalism and economic socialism. I hold the same position. Bearing that in mind, which party, Mr. Galloway, which party should one support and vote for? Bearing in mind the first past the post system, which realistically ends up in a Tory, usually Tory, or Labour government. I admire what you and your new party does, and also what the SDP has to offer. Yet, you think of UKIP. UKIP got, what, 9% of the vote? I can't remember exactly, but UKIP got a massive amount of percentage of the national vote, and yet they only secured one MP, who I believe, from memory, actually defected from the Conservative Party.
Yes.
How do we solve this problem?
Well, let me just interrupt, John, mainly for this reason. Not for any legal reason, there are none, but for reasons of good taste. I don't proselytize for my own political party on this show. I don't think that would be fair to RT and Sputnik, and I don't think it would be fair or ethical to the audience either. So I can't actually directly answer your question, except in this regard. If you are inviting me to concur or agree that Labour is better than the Conservatives, I will not. I do not regard Labour as better than the Conservatives, neither the Conservatives better than Labour. For me, they are two cheeks of the same backside, and we know what emerges from that. It's not at all an argument for me that I must do this or this will happen. I don't believe in voting for the lesser of two evils because that only encourages evil, even if we could agree which was the lesser of two evils. And on this day, above all, the anniversary of the catastrophe in Iraq, which is still unfolding, please don't invite me to say that I think a Labour government is better somehow than a Conservative one. Not this day, please. Now, let me go live to Bristol because there are incredible scenes. This is live scenes in Bristol, in the city centre, in Bridewell Street, if you know it. This is outside a police station. The police stations have been taken over, police vans on fire. Let me read you the notes. A demonstration against plans to give police more powers to deal with peaceful protests has spilled over into violence. Hundreds of people gathered at College Green in Bristol before marching to a police station on nearby New Bridewell Street, where graffiti was sprayed on an Avon and Somerset police vehicle, and it was rocked side to side by protesters. Demonstrators were then seen smashing the police station's windows in with skateboards, while graffitied police vans were set on fire. Here's some shots from earlier. There's the skateboards. That's a police station they are attacking. Protesters were also seen facing up to riot police who were deployed as the march turned violent as night fell. Police said missiles had been thrown at them, including a firework, and that they had been verbally abused. Mounted officers were forced to intervene to disperse the large crowd. Wow. There is a police van on fire. This is in the centre of Bristol. I think that's near Cabot Circus. That's just really by the shopping centre in Bristol. If you are there or were there or know what's happening, please do call the show so that we can... this is now live pictures again. There's the mounted police. My goodness, it's not even 9 o'clock. Going to be a long night. Going to be a long night in the centre of Bristol. We'll return to it, of course, but who should have the right to protest? This is directly related to the subject on our poll. Groups that we like, everyone or no one. You can vote for another 15 minutes at least on my Twitter feed and on my Telegram channel. Rachel says, unlawful demonstrations against unlawful governments sounds about right. People don't seem to understand that the mass media is a mass deception service. Richard says, I haven't voted since John Smith died. I will never vote for prehistoric, antiquated, backward capitalism. And Jane says, it's a police state now. We, the people, have no voice any longer. Well, you do on here, Jane. Call us up. And Chris says, everyone should have the right to protest as long as it is within the law. If you think the law is wrong, then use other forms of protest. Struggling and threatening violence to others is not protesting, it's being a thug. And Fra says, this bill sounds reminiscent of the trade union law brought in by Thatcher. It in effect ended the picket line powers during the miners' strike. This will do the same. Kill the protests by attrition and prosecution. Let's take a 60-second break. Count them.
Radio Sputnik.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
We got a call from West Wales on the Iraq War. Stuart, go ahead, Stuart.
Hiya, mate. I just want to share a perception with you from way back when the war started. A few days before Bush announced they had to go to war, there was an item on the late-night BBC News from the Washington correspondent who was reporting on corporate corruption scandal in America. And he said that because George Bush was on the board of some Texas companies, that he would be dragged into it too. And then...
This was Enron. Was this the Enron scandal?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know the name of that. I just know it was a scandal. It was, ripping through all the... There was so much corruption in the high levels of these corporations. And George Bush was named in it on that BBC report. Then a couple of days later, Bush came on the world stage and went, "We got to go to war." And then everyone went, "What? Why? What's going on?"
Of course, these kind of things will have had some bearing, but not the principal bearing. The Bush administration had been preparing for war since at least 9/11, 2001. So the best part of 2 years before. They invaded Afghanistan first, and everyone believed that they were going to turn to Iraq. Indeed, General Wesley Clark, a very senior American general and one-time presidential candidate, he describes, you can find it easily, it's part of it is in my The Killings of Tony Blair, my film. He describes how at the Pentagon, a worried Pentagon official told him that there were 7 countries that the United States was now going to invade.
Remember that?
And most of them they then did. Yeah. So you remember it, Stuart?
Yeah, I do. It was only the confusion of everybody at the timing of the announcement from Bush. And then when Blair went over to have a chat with Bush to find out what was going on, he came back and, he came to Parliament and said, "We have no choice, we must follow America." And, that what was laid out was the fact that if that scandal, Enron, I don't know, carried on, there's a chance that it would cause major economic problems in America and Europe. And so by following America, it distracted all the people away from that scandal, and it just died a death. Nobody heard any more about it.
Well, okay, thanks for that, Stuart. As you know, I'm not a believer generally in these kind of theories. The American ruling elite had decided to destroy Iraq, number one, for oil, number two, to demonstrate their absolute hegemony in the world at that time. Remember, the Soviet Union was no more. Russia had not yet risen back onto its feet. China was economically still a long distance behind the United States, and its foreign policy was consequently almost invisible. It was a moment in time at which the United States thought that they could terrorize the whole world with American power. The opposite, of course, happened, as is frequently the case with such vainglorious projects. Let's go to Rory in Montrose. Go ahead, Rory.
Hello again, George.
Nice to hear from you.
Back. Oh, yeah, thanks for having me back. Someone I know recently said that you've become a, quote, total loony as you are a socialist saying you are voting Tory at this year's election. And I'd really like you to explain to this person why you are voting Conservative as a socialist this year, as they clearly don't get why it's important for you and for me to vote Tory, tactically.
Well, handily, I just explained to an earlier caller. For me, there is no difference between Labour and the Conservatives. especially today, don't tempt me, especially today, the Labour government killed 1 million people. 1 million. Think of how many people that is. The Labour government killed 1 million people. But if I said I was voting for them, your friend would not think me a loony at all. If you think of it in that perspective, it's completely ridiculous. I'm voting tactically. In my constituency, there are only two possible outcomes. Either the SNP will capture another seat, or the Conservative will hold it. In those circumstances, it's simply a no-brainer for me. The Tories are for Christmas, separatism is for life, and the life of all generations still to come. So if, like me, you believe that Scottish nationalism and the breakup of the country is by far and away exponentially more devastatingly dangerous to the well-being of the people of this country, why would I have even a moment's contemplation about casting my vote in that direction? I mean, I ask you, Stuart, to ask, Rory, to ask him, does he think I should vote Labour for Keith Starmer? Why? Why would somebody like me vote for somebody like him? Last word to you, Rory.
Thanks again, George. That's very good like last week. I will share this with them, so they fully understand, because they're also a socialist like you, and I don't think they completely understand why you as a socialist is voting Conservative. I don't think they actually looked into the reason why. Someone quoted one of your tweets, and they obviously follow them, and said that you'd somehow gone completely mad because...
Do I sound mad? I think I sound absolutely cogent and clear. My views are long-standing and consistent one with the other. I fought for Britain in the Brexit campaign. I'm fighting for Britain now to stop it being broken up to serve the interests of a narrow nationalist clique who will take Scotland immediately if they can, into the European Union. Now, not only would that be a disaster for the working class people in Scotland, it would be a clear and present danger to the rest of this country, because Scotland would be allowed into the European Union if it was only as a cat's paw against the rest of the UK, only to cause problems for the people in England and Wales, only to weaken the remaining parts of the United Kingdom. So for all of these reasons, I say to everyone in this country, you have a stake in defeating the SNP in May. And if you do, we can get off the never-ending hamster wheel and return to real politics, the real problems faced by ordinary people in Scotland. Thanks for the call. Michelle is in Slough, and she's on the line next. Michelle, go ahead.
Hello, George. I want to ask you if you think that the situation, particularly with coming down on peaceful protesters, has got worse and worse and worse since 2003. And the reason I say that is, way back in 2004, and you yourself might remember this, I was involved in a peaceful candlelit vigil at Slough Town Hall, objecting to this massive incinerator at Heathrow Airport. And I was standing there with some wonderful people from the Respect Party and the Stop the War Coalition. And we also went on this march where we were all photographed. Now, to the town hall that night, and we chained ourselves up. We chained ourselves and our children up with paper chains. The response from the police that evening, way back in 2004, and the police themselves couldn't believe it, was to send 3 police wagons and 36 officers to the town hall that night. I mean, I think it was bad then, but I think it's something that's been getting worse and worse and worse since the war in Iraq. Do you?
Yes, I do, and that's a really important call. Michelle, I'm glad that you made it. You probably were also infiltrated back in 2004 by the special groups of police that were infiltrating such dangerous people as women protesting about the building of an incinerator. Certainly they were infiltrating all kinds of entirely non-violent and non-threatening protest movements, something which is still not fully accounted for in the courts. But it's very important indeed that protests are allowed and that protests should be peaceful. A protest that becomes a riot, like the one in Bristol now, will go up like a rocket, sure, but it will come down like a burnt stick, of no use to anyone. And all that will be achieved by a riot is to strengthen the securocratic bureaucracies. I mean, look at these people smashing in police stations, setting fire to police vehicles. No one in the country will countenance that. No one will support that. And so if the police now come back and demand more powers to deal with this kind of riot, the vast majority of people in the country will support them. Sorry for that, Michelle. Thanks for the call. Anthony is in Bristol, but he's not calling about that. Go ahead, Anthony.
Oh, hi there, George. Really pleased to be able to speak to you. It's the first time I've called you.
Thank you.
And like you, I feel so strongly about the Iraq War. It's something personally I've never really come to terms with, even though it's 18 years since that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I really wanted to talk to you, George, about the role of Sir Keir Starmer in formulating the legal advice for Tony Blair to justify his policy to go to war against Iraq in 2003. Because as I understand it, Sir Keir Starmer was the Attorney General at the time who actually devised the legal advice so that Tony Blair could justify his decision, and then, I believe, strengthened it on Tony Blair's request so that it would look more politically convenient. Now, you would probably know more about that than I would, George.
I do, and therefore it's my duty to tell you that that is not true. Keir Starmer was a nobody back in 2003. He wasn't in Parliament, still less in the government. He's guilty of many crimes and many sins, but those are not amongst them. But you're right, Anthony, the Labour law officers did change their legal advice on the demand of the client being Tony Blair, the Prime Minister. And what is the point of a senior law officer if in fact all they are is a rubber stamp for the political master? This and its counterpart in Edinburgh over the Alex Salmond affair is a major fault line which is opening up in our Constitution. The role of law officers and their place in cabinets, like the Boris Johnson cabinet now and the Nicola Sturgeon cabinet, at least until tomorrow, in Edinburgh. This is a major issue that British constitutional wizards are going to have to address pretty damned quickly. Now, thanks for that, Anthony. In Bristol, your town, there are atrocious scenes. Police vehicles are being attacked. There's another. This is earlier, before it got dark. I don't know if there's police in that van, but that's happening These things are happening right now in Bristol. Thousands have now joined in, and you can see that it started off pretty hairy and has gotten far worse. Police stations. Yeah, there's injured officers, there's burning police stations, there's burning police vehicles, and they'll be hell to pay for this. And one of the things that we'll pay with is, I suspect, more of our civil liberties. Now, I've launched the second poll. Will anyone ever be prosecuted over the Iraq War? A, yes. B, no. You can vote now on my Twitter feed, but I need the news from Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The United Kingdom has seen a third consecutive day with a record number of COVID vaccinations after 873,784 people received a jab over 24 hours. NHS England revealed during 1 hour on Saturday jabs were given at a rate of 26 a second. NHS Chief Executive Sir Simon Stevens said, "In just one day, we vaccinated the equivalent of the entire adult populations of Liverpool, Southampton and Oxford combined." Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the figure, tweeting, "A huge thank you to everyone involved, and please come forward to get your jab when you are invited to do so." The figure equates to roughly 1.3% of the UK population receiving a vaccination in the last 24 hours and means more than 2.24 million people have received a jab in the last 3 days. The European Union should not build walls around the distribution of vaccines and should seek to meet its contractual obligations, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said. His comments follow a threat by the European Commission to block vaccine exports to countries including the UK. EU Commissioner Mairead McGuinness said all sides needed to calm down. Buckingham Palace is set to review its diversity policies across all royal households. The work will look at improving diversity at Buckingham Palace, Clarence House and Kensington Palace. Royal sources have stressed that the palace already has policies, procedures and programmes in place, but has not seen the progress it would like. The work began, sources claimed, before the Duke and Duchess of Sussex made allegations of racism within the royal family. Prince Harry and Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey included claims that they had been asked how dark their son's skin would be before his birth. The boss of Australian airline Qantas has said that governments are going to insist on vaccines for international travellers. Coronavirus vaccines are seen as crucial to reviving an industry that saw worldwide passenger numbers fall 75.6% last year. Chief Executive Alan Joyce said many governments were talking about vaccinations a condition of entry. Even if they weren't, he said, he believed the airline should enforce its own policy. Millions of people around the world have celebrated Nowruz, a festival that marks the Persian New Year and the official beginning of spring. Nowruz begins at the spring equinox when the sun crosses the equator and day and night are equal length. It's mainly celebrated in Iran, Afghanistan and the Kurdish regions of Iraq and Turkey, as well as parasites in India and diaspora communities around the rest of the world. This year, which in the Persian calendar is the year 1400s, celebrations in many places have had to take place amid coronavirus restrictions. The leading opposition candidate in Congo-Brazzaville's presidential election is in hospital with COVID-19 while voting is underway. In a video circulating on social media, 61-year-old Guy Bryce Parfait Colilas is seen briefly removing an oxygen mask to tell his supporters that he is fighting death. He urges them to vote in the election. President Denis Sassou Nguesso, who is widely seen as an authoritarian ruler, is expected to win again. Turkey has pulled out of an international accord designed to protect women from domestic violence. President Erdogan has annulled Turkey's ratification of the Istanbul Convention 10 years after it was the first country to sign the landmark European treaty. No reason was given for the withdrawal, but top government officials said Turkey's domestic law would protect women's rights instead. A visitor at the San Diego Zoo was arrested on Friday shortly after taking his 2-year-old daughter into an elephant enclosure, according to the San Diego Police Department. Jose Navarrete made it into the elephant enclosures with his daughter after passing multiple barriers. Once the father and daughter were inside the enclosure, an elephant noticed the pair and started to trot towards them. When Navarrete tried to exit the enclosure with his 2-year-old, he dropped her but was able to pick her up. He is booked into the San Diego County Jail, according to police, and he is charged with child cruelty and is currently being held on a $100,000 bail. And finally, the Hollywood actor Seth Rogen, who's been in several stoner comedies, has launched his cannabis lifestyle brand called Houseplant in the United States. Together with screenwriter Evan Goldberg, he sets sights on the burgeoning cannabis market. Houseplant's goods include ashtrays and lighters shipping across the country, together with strains of cannabis available for delivery in California, where consumption is legal. Their co-founders include producers James Weaver and Alex McAtee, as well as venture investor Michael Moore, who is heading Houseplant as CEO. It comes just 2 years after Houseplant debuted in Canada. There is a growing momentum to legalize cannabis use across the United States. In November, Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota joined 11 other states, as well as Washington, D.C., in approving its recreational use and sales. And New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo has signaled his intention to do the same. The legal cannabis industry is projected to be worth $41.5 billion by 2025. And while it's often asserted by advocates that cannabis is safer than alcohol consumption, a 2020 study showed that today's increasingly potent strains are linked with greater risks of addiction, anxiety, and psychosis. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now the doctor will see you shortly. Dr. Ranjeet Brar, Moats medic, physician, surgeon, medical doctor who has helped us through all of this coronavirus crisis. If you've got any calls you want to make specifically to Dr. Brar, get them in right now. 02077 982 255, or in the US 001 757 744 4480. Tweet us, of course, at George Galloway at RTUK News. My second poll has gone off, if you'll forgive me, like a rocket. Will anyone ever be prosecuted over the Iraq War? Yes, a hardy 6% of you. No, 94% of you. You can vote on my Twitter feed or on my Telegram channel, which I now know to be t.me/George Galloway. And don't forget, my shop, my books, my films, and so on are very good offers at the moment. Take advantage of them. www.georgegalloway.shop. Now, Dr. Brar, are you there? Can I now turn to him? Let me do another couple of tweets first then. The last one I read was from Jennifer. So, Richard, this country is finished thanks to 40 years of abuse to the British economy. 40 years of borrowing trillions and endless money printing. George, why do you want Scotland to be dragged into the gutter? Blimey, Richard, I wasn't expecting that bizarre non sequitur at the end of that. Holton says, everyone should have the right to protest. Because there's a pandemic, it's probably best not to. And John says, the day you lose your freedom of speech and your right to protest is the very day you have become a prisoner to the system. Many fought and died for these rights, and they should never, ever be given up. And Billy says, every British citizen has the right to protest as long as it's peaceful. And Ian says, as long as the group that is protesting hasn't been banned for racism or inciting terrorism or some other terrible thing, then I think they should be allowed a voice. Who decides which groups we don't like? Silencing protest just drives it underground to fester. And Tanner says, everybody has a right to protest. My political enemies of yesteryear are my friends now. One note of caution, please treat serving police officers with respect and worry about their health and safety. My sister served for 30 years. Protect them. Thanks for that. Let's go to Dr. Ranjeet Brar. Dr. Brar, thanks for joining us. As always, you haven't missed, it's like a heartbeat every week throughout the whole of this pandemic, and a mighty heartbeat at that. Bring us up to date, will you? Seems to me, and I'm not paying as much close attention as I was, because my mind is on other things, but the number of cases, the number of deaths, the number of hospitalizations, in Britain at least, seems to be falling very rapidly.
I think that's right, George. I think part of the reason you and indeed the rest of the country are paying less attention than they were is that it's less of a serious threat than it was. The cases are right down. So it was really just in January we were talking there were 500,000 cases, test-proven cases in Britain each week, George. Now this week we're right down. The number of cases that we've seen is 37,000. The number of deaths, while still not zero, is down to 658, whereas it has been in excess of 7,000 in a single week. So it is rapidly falling away. And this is overwhelmingly due to the fact that the most vulnerable sections of the population, we said right at the beginning of this pandemic, and we have been proven right on the data that we had then, that this was a disease, an illness, which targets the eldest and the most infirm, obese diabetics, over 80s in particular. The vast majority of those people in our country have now been vaccinated. The vaccination figures are really good. About 40% of the population has been vaccinated. That's 26.8 million people have had the first dose. Now 2.1 million have had the second dose. I was one of the first to have the 2 doses in my capacity as a frontline healthcare worker. But now my father, for example, who's 82, has had his second dose. That's proven overwhelmingly to be safe. And this is something that is moving us now out of the period where we're going to have continual lockdowns. In contrast to what we're seeing within the EU, where the percentage of the population who have been vaccinated still remains between 5 and 8 or 9% at the most, and causing a great deal of dissension. And also we're witnessing the third rather massive spike of infections in European countries, particularly in Germany, France and Italy. Italy has become now another country to exceed 100,000 coronavirus deaths. So, having failed to do the non-pharmaceutical measures first, which were the measures which really could have prevented this from being a massive problem, what we have done right is roll out the vaccination. The vaccination really is stopping this in its tracks, and it will be soon time for us to move away from this lockdown. And the many social issues that need dealing with will come to the fore of our agenda, George.
Social and health issues, isn't that right? So many people have, locking down and isolating isn't a cost-free option. The impact on mental health, the lack of hospital treatment and operations for many other conditions, these have all suffered grievously, haven't they?
They have, and I think it's going to be incumbent upon clinicians to ensure that we really do resume business as normal, that we're not forced into a permanent model of telephone appointments, video appointments. This has been an agenda which has been being pursued because it's a way of cheapening healthcare, and it's also a way of furthering the agenda of privatization. One of the reasons we've done so very badly is the extent to which the capacity of our NHS has been run down, services centralized, even over and above the amount that normal technological progression and medical advance should allow, so that we are really beleaguered in terms of the number of beds, our capacity to deal with inpatients, our capacity to deal with outpatient appointments. We are now a vastly under-resourced health system. And that has impacted on the fact that throughout much of this, right now, I can say that, only 7% of our beds have COVID patients in them. But at the height of this pandemic, that was as much as 40% of our acute beds, precisely because we have so few remaining beds. Our bed capacity has halved over a period of 20 to 30 years, George. And that's had a huge impact, along with all the other measures to privatise our system. This is something that Bob Gill has addressed in his latest film, which is starting to have more showings. We'll have 2 shows this week. And I would encourage people to look up Bob Gill and have a look at his film and his film screenings, which are coming. The Great NHS Heist is the name of his movie, and you can have a look at that on Twitter. I encourage everyone to look at it. Those are real and pressing issues, and they are very much that agenda has been furthered. The agenda of privatisation has been furthered. I spoke with Bob at an event which can be seen on the Workers' Party GB Twitter page, and I would encourage people to go and have a look at that. These are ongoing issues which will affect all of our ability to cope with our ongoing health needs through and beyond the coronavirus pandemic, George.
Now, just before calls, because there's a lot for you tonight, the European Union has performed catastrophically on both counts, us on only one. On the non-pharmaceutical things we could and should have done, we failed disastrously. On the vaccine, we have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. In the European Union, they failed on both. And when I look at the incredibly low levels of vaccination in the European Union, as you said, 5 to 8%, while we are, about 50%. This is such a vast gulf. It must provoke serious political implications, consequences for the EU when this is over. But the fact that they've got millions of doses of the Oxford vaccine and have invented spurious reason after reason to avoid using them, I find it difficult to separate that from their bitterness at us leaving the EU.
I think there will be bitterness over Brexit, but also if you look at the look at the political apparatus of Brussels, it is so insulated from the real sentiment of the working people on the ground in any of its constituent countries. That's why there's now really huge tensions developing between the major states over their policy of trade, actually, around this question of vaccine. Angela Merkel herself 2 days ago came out and made a further statement saying that, if the EU Medicines Agency won't accept that the Russian Sputnik vaccine is a valid vaccine, if they won't grant it a license, which is what she said she'd prefer, and she said Germany would have to go her own separate way, strongly giving a signal that Germany would, following Hungary, following Slovakia, following Serbia, so states which we are told are marginal to the EU, which have themselves flouted the central EU Medicines Agency and under emergency powers, essentially, have given licenses to the Sputnik vaccine and are using it. The Sputnik vaccine has shown to be perhaps the most effective vaccine in the world, exactly. with many things that make it easier to roll out, including its cost, which is low, and including the fact that it can be administered at room temperature. It's now been given a license in more than 50 countries around the world, including countries with who are at political variance, because this is not a question of just politics, it's a question of the real daily needs of people who are under threat. And so if it was a question simply of doing what's necessary for the health of the working population, this vaccine would have been okayed. And similarly, there were similar things that drove skepticism in France towards the British vaccine and these questions of Brexit and politics, really. So this kind of the system of Brussels has interfered unquestionably with the individual nations and their ability to roll out the vaccine, and being out of that has, conversely, actually helped our government.
Yeah.
Corrupt as it has proved, and all of the things that we've said that our government has done wrong, it has helped it to secure and roll out via the NHS again this time the vaccine program in our country, George.
Let's take some calls. Adam in Streatham. Go ahead, Adam.
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air. Go on.
Thank you very much. God bless you both. Doctor, are you familiar with the work of Gert Vandenbosch?
Go on, Adam. Summarise it quickly.
Okay. Well, he's issued a paper, and he's a senior vaccine person, of great repute, and he's very, very concerned about the rollout of the vaccines because they are prophylactic, and his point is that these prophylactic vaccines should only be used after. And not during a pandemic, and because what it does, it gives the virus the ability to hop and skip and jump and change and adapt, which is what we're experiencing now. And so we started with what was a natural pandemic, and he is concerned that we now have a...
Well, I'm not familiar with his work, and neither am I a doctor, but the vaccination rollout is going pretty bloody well. From where I'm sitting. Doctor.
So I haven't read his work. I'll be interested for his paper or where it was published. However, what really is driving, I wouldn't say it was becoming an unnatural pandemic. That's not true. This is a natural pandemic. And in terms of the variants and the variations, that is seen wherever really the virus is allowed to run rampant. So the best way to stop the virus spreading and mutating, which are the two processes which will happen simultaneously, were the non-pharmaceutical measures, which we saw adapted very early by China very successfully and have allowed them to return to normal without vaccinating their population. They are now vaccinating their population to stop the reintroduction of the coronavirus as a world pandemic, but they did very well, and that would have stopped both spread and the variants. Variants will continue to exist. It wouldn't be driven by vaccination. I see what you're saying. Any selection pressure makes the vaccine change, but overwhelmingly, what's happening is the mass presence of the virus, its replication billions of times within tens of millions of people is what's allowing it to replicate rather than vaccination per se. All vaccination essentially is prophylactic because all vaccination is given to people to stop them getting a disease rather than to treat a disease. So that doesn't make sense, and it would apply to all vaccinations, and it doesn't apply. So I don't know the doctor's work, but I don't think it can be true.
Adam, thanks for that. Brian's in Cornwall. Go ahead, Brian.
Hiya, George. Yes, Doctor. I took my Uncle Jimmy to have. He's 87 years of age. We had the Pfizer injection. I had it as well because I took him with him. I'm a bit concerned because now they reckon they're going to, if they haven't got enough of that Pfizer one, they're going to give us the Oxford one to mix them. Is that any good?
Doctor.
It's a really good question. So none of the manufacturers recommend mixing them. They work with different methods. I haven't seen any papers yet to suggest that there's good efficacy from doing so. But what there are relatively good results now showing that there's quite high safety even from a single dose. So I think it is still advised, as far as I'm aware. I don't think there's been any change in this to have the same vaccine. There are cases of different vaccine manufacturers collaborating to try and increase the efficacy. That's particularly the case with the AstraZeneca and the Sputnik, but not the Pfizer. And certainly Pfizer have not liked the fact that we've been delaying our interval between the first and the second dose. So I don't think there's any evidence to support having a mix of the Oxford, AstraZeneca, and the Pfizer vaccine. Probably it would not be harmful, but I don't think it's ideal. There's no trial evidence to support it at this stage. But I wouldn't get hugely concerned, but I would probably try and have the two vaccines of the same variety where possible.
Thank you. Michael in Washington State in the U.S. Go ahead, Michael.
Yes, thanks for taking my call.
Welcome.
I've been resistant to getting a vaccine, so I had to do a lot of research. And I recently heard the Pfizer CEO say, hey, let's give them a third booster. We can turn this into a lot of money. And so I'm wondering, are these guys with Pfizer and Moderna making a vaccine that is so specific that they're going to have to turn this into an industry? Or perhaps is Novavax with their vaccine sufficient to take care of all the changes in it?
Good question, Michael. Doctor?
I'm not sure exactly what you're saying about the third booster. There's been talk about certainly whether variations would need adaptation in the future, and we might have to continue the vaccination program. There's unquestionably the case that Pfizer is a company with a long record of abuses. If you look at some of their very aggressive bargaining with particularly third world nations, but even nations as large and populous as the BRICS countries, including Brazil. They've been asking for remarkable indemnities, remarkable concessions. They've been asking for almost, quasi-diplomatic rights, rights to change laws of countries to indemnify themselves, all of which adds to people's incredible mistrust towards the vaccine. Despite that, because it's a serious health issue, overwhelmingly people are accepting vaccination where it's offered. Overwhelmingly that is the case. So, the vaccine does work. The company is an extremely unscrupulous, massive multinational company. That is the system under which we live. While we live under this system, medicines will be continued to manufactured by such companies, and the business and managerial arm of those companies you will continue to act in those unscrupulous ways. The only way we can change that is having a very well-run and orchestrated national pharmaceutical program as part of our National Health Service. We're a long way from that. We're traveling in the opposite direction in this country. Rather, we are, in fact, breaking down our core National Health Service and parceling it out and privatizing it and giving companies the right to sue it if they don't get the contracts they want. So we are moving away from that in this country and the United States, where you already have essentially a privatized system where health industry calls the shots, is responsible for perhaps 70 or 80 million of your fellow compatriots having essentially very little or no access to healthcare whatsoever. So this is a system we need to move away from to get rid of the abuses, but the technology itself, vaccination itself, medicine itself, clearly does represent a way forward with this and so many other medical problems.
Thanks, Michael. Eve is in Idaho. Go ahead, Eve.
Hello. Yes, I have a question, a very simple question to ask. I don't know how easy it is to answer, but can you make a comparison with the pro and the cons and taking the politics out between Pfizer and AstraZeneca? Doctor?
Yeah, the AstraZeneca vaccine has is obviously the pros. The pros for the AstraZeneca are that it's cheap. I think they're offering it for $3 or $4 around the world to a lot of third world countries. It's going to be available in about 1.4 billion doses next year, so there's a large supply of it. It can be stored at a relatively normal temperature. Its efficacy on the studies so far showed it not to be hugely efficacious, about 70% compared to some of the 90% figures, but that does seem to increase over time and reach more like an 80% figure. So those are all the pros. The pros of the Pfizer vaccine, it's a new technology. Okay, so however, it is shown to be very effective, perhaps 93% effective after a short period of time, and that's even with the delay between the two doses. It does, however, need to be stored at very low temperatures. They're a kind of unscrupulous company, and it's an extremely expensive vaccine. Therefore, I think, for all of the very aggressive corporate techniques they're using to bargain, particularly with countries of the third world, I think it's not going to be the major solution. It's being pushed very heavily. But if I was going to give a real pro, it would be to the Sputnik vaccine, which I think has shown incredible efficacy. It can be used at room temperature and is increasingly being recognized as the major tool, I think, to deal with this pandemic. Many good Chinese vaccines. Also, I think a fifth or sixth was recently added. So, there are many vaccines available. There are many ways through this. Of course, the major problem, which is stopping states really dealing with this and so many other health problems, is poverty and inequality. We live in a world in which a tiny handful of billionaires have more money than entire nations and half the planet's population. These are the real problems which are causing not only the coronavirus pandemic, but all the problems. We know 14 million children die of malnutrition and related diseases, very treatable things that we treated with a bag of saline and an admission to hospital. That is a problem which needs urgent solution. Poverty is the biggest killer in our world. But yes, for the coronavirus pandemic, which is real, vaccination does work. Any of the vaccines are reasonably effective, but the cheapest and the easiest stored will be best. And those which are able to supply, I would strongly recommend having a vaccination where it's available.
Try getting the Sputnik in Idaho Falls. Thanks for that, Eve. Thank you, Dr. Ranjeet. See you next week, God willing. Will anyone ever be prosecuted over the Iraq War? Yes, 7%. No, 93%. What do you think? You can vote until the end of the show. Lots and lots of questions and calls for Dr. Brar. He can't take them all. He's a hard-working doctor with a life to lead. I think we've had our money's worth from him, especially as he doesn't charge any money at all. Let me take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik.
Let's take a call. Go ahead, Kenny.
Hi, George. Yeah, I just want to talk about the trans issue that you were speaking about earlier.
Yeah,
I've
go
got a
ahead.
book in front of me by Douglas Murray, and he's got a paragraph here I'd just like to read out, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was standing on the corner at a quarter.
All right, I'll get him off. He's a nutter. He's a nutter. 02077 982 255 is the number if you're in the UK, or if you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480, or tweet me, of course.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Well, let's take Richard, shall we, in Manchester, on Scotland. Go ahead, Richard.
Hi, George. I'm very, very sorry about the trouble that you and your family have had up in Scotland.
Thank you, Richard.
I voiced an opinion to my son-in-law, who's a former soldier in Belfast, and we were talking about the bitterness and the hatred that is coming out of all this, and he fully agreed. I said, I wish George wasn't going up there, because it looks to me as though, in my terms, everything is going to kick off, and I think it's going to get worse up there before it gets better. Other than...
We need a time out on it, Richard, before it goes too far.
I think yesterday, all day yesterday, I was looking at articles with regards to the Scottish executive meeting, in which, I think I'm correct in saying this, George, £600,000 worth of money has gone missing from the coffers, which was put on side for a proposed referendum. And £500,000 of that cannot be accounted for at all. And they're waiting now for somebody three executives, three financial executives, very well qualified people, actually have resigned. And we're looking now, or they're looking for somebody to go to the police and make a complaint. And then I believe, and I am told by a friend in Scotland, there will probably be a lot of arrests and put all this salmon.
Well, let me stop you, because we mustn't run ahead of ourselves. This is an internal SNP story. There have been complaints for some time about a lack of transparency in the books of the SNP. That won't come as a surprise, because There's a gigantic lack of transparency in the much bigger books of the Scottish government that they run. But their own members are protesting about the apparent disappearance of £600,000 that was supposed to be ring-fenced for the referendum campaign. And there are reports today that 3 of their auditors have resigned, complaining that the chief executive of the party, the husband of Nicola Sturgeon, it's like the Ceausescus, all under one duvet, power in Scotland, assuming they share a duvet, of course. The auditors may well now take this matter further, because it seems to have been pre-prepared, because posters began to go up on SNP headquarters and rooms and shops highlighting this missing money. So it's another part of a sea of troubles, which range from this right up to the conspiracy to jail Alex Salmond, with lots in between. Rampant racism in between, for example, of the kind I described today. Ever more blood-curdlingly violent threats, which haven't yet produced a martyr like poor Joe Cox, MP, rest in peace, a mother of young children who was murdered by a political opponent in cold blood whilst on her public duties. It hasn't yet resulted in anything like that, but that can only be a matter of time, because the level of foul abuse, of calling, as I said earlier, someone like me, I'm not Scottish. I'm not Scottish. Scottish is a state of mind, it turns out. It doesn't matter that you were born there, that your parents were born there, that your family lives there, that you live there. They're more Scottish than you. And they prove that by waving flags and hurling invective at other people. Well, that's not Scottish as I understand it to be. But they have a problem. You see, nationalism is by definition ethnic. You can put ribbons on it. You can say that we are civic and joyous and welcoming. Unless you disagree with us, we're welcoming. But at root, nationalism defines politics on a national basis. And that's why I hate nationalism. I hate it everywhere. I've hated it always. I don't believe politics is about nations. I believe that politics is about class, is about interests. And real politics is the clash of interests and the democratic decision to serve this interest or that. That's politics for me. I have nothing in common with the Scottish racist, beyond having been born entirely accidentally in both our cases on the same piece of rock that the Scottish racist was born on. Where's that at? I've got far more in common with someone who thinks like me in Newcastle or in Manchester or in Birmingham or in London. Richard, thanks for that call. Fraser is in Edinburgh. Go ahead, Fraser.
Hi, George. Nice to talk to you. I'd like to actually talk to you about that, actually, what you just talked about there. You had a little bit of a Twitter argument with Hamza Youssef over the Scottish hate crime bill, I believe, this week. I'm just like looking at your thoughts on it. So you said to him that you, as a Celt, are more Scottish than he is because he is of Pakistani.
Fraser, can you actually read English?
Yes.
Why don't you read it before ridiculously Baudelarizing it on national, international radio? Not only did I not say that, not only would I never say that, I said the precise opposite of that. Go on.
Right.
Do you think I carry around words like Celt in my mind? Do you think I give a toss whether someone's a Celt or not? As it happens, most people in Scotland are not Celts. There are more Celts in England than there are in Scotland. I couldn't give two monkeys whether someone was a Celt. I said the exact opposite of what you have just said. I've said you are not more Scottish than me. That's true, isn't it? He isn't more Scottish than me, is he?
No, he's not.
Exactly.
George, you're right.
Exactly. Comma. He was the one that claimed to be a Celt. He sent Celtic greetings to our cousins in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day. But he's not a Celt. I'm not a Celt. Most people in Scotland are not Celts. And therefore, on whose behalf was he extending Celtic greetings? I'll tell you what he was doing, Fraser. He was blowing a dog whistle from the base of Scottish nationalists who think that they are carrying on the fight in Ireland, which the Irish people have resolved. There's no war in Ireland, so people that think like that want to bring that war to Scotland. It's a kind of Ulsterization of Scottish politics, up with which we will not put. I believe that everyone who's born in Scotland is equally Scottish, for what that's worth. There's not actually anything to be proud of in being a Celt, and right at this moment, there's really not much to be proud of about being Scottish. But hey, Fraser, that's where we are. We're trapped. We were born there. We'll have to try and save our country. John in Ipswich on the hate crime bill. Go ahead, John.
Hello, George. How are you?
I'm
having
well,
a good evening?
By the grace of God, I'm safe and well so far.
That's brilliant. I just wanted to talk about the Scottish hate crime, bill, like the new legislation that's come in. I have family in Scotland, and they're really anxious. They're actually quite worried because what's happening is it's not attacking people who are inciting violence. It's attacking normal everyday Scots. They don't have. It's saying that hate speech is going to be a crime over the dinner table.
Yeah, John, there are already plenty of laws that could have been used to deal with anyone inciting violence or hatred.
Exactly,
There was no need to bring in this bill. This bill is not
that's
about...
totally right.
Yeah.
That's totally correct, yeah.
This bill is not about Catholics hating Protestants or vice versa, black people hating white people, or more often vice versa. This bill is about trans rights. The reason for this bill is to make it a criminal offence to say, as I am still free to say here in London, that men do not become women merely by declaring themselves so to be. I can say that freely here, but under the hate crime bill, even if I said it at my own dinner table, I may be arrested and prosecuted.
Exactly. You won't even be able to state facts in your own home. It's absolutely insane. I mean, and talking about transgenderism, it's so satanic. I mean, it stems from in the 1920s, a man called Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a Jew in Germany. He was the first trans advocate, right? He was a gay Jew, and he promoted transgenderism. And, that was just one of the many Jews who are doing similar things today. And it's going to cause a reaction, a fascist...
Stop him, cut him off. Anti-Semitism is absolutely forbidden on this show. And I apologize to anyone who was upset by that call. I have no idea about the person in Germany to which he refers. I do know that 6 million Jewish people and many, many gay people were murdered in Germany by fascism. And I'm not going to allow language on this show which in any way cheapens or coarsens that. So please ban him from the show, and I beg you to accept my apology. Alexandra in Lincolnshire, go ahead.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Hi, and I do hope you're staying safe after the terrible threats you've had.
Yeah, it's been an enervating weekend, Alexandra. It's quite unexpected and extremely tense, even for me, but more especially for my children who had no idea what was happening, why they were being bundled into a car and relocated. But thank you, very kind of you. Go ahead.
Okay, I would like to see Tony Blair prosecuted. As an English lady that spent many years living in Iraq, I know Iraq how it used to be, and I spent the happiest days of my life there. I think you know who I am, George.
I don't, and don't tell me on the air, but I'm very moved by what you just said. Tell us where in Iraq you were and what it was like.
Wonderful. I went there, first of all, in 1966, and I got married there. Baghdad was a wonderful place. There was nightclubs, pop singers. Even Ilham is one of the famous pop singers. He studied here in Chelsea. The people were fantastic. There was mixed marriages. Nobody cared who was Sunni, Christian. Everybody was just friendly. It was a great place to live. So
it has now been destroyed. There is no Iraq anymore. Not only is it not the Iraq you remember, but there's not even one Iraq. There are several Iraqs. There's warlordism. There's sectarian violence and armed groups. There's proxy wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran being fought out on Iraqi soil and amongst Iraqi people. It's a thoroughly miserable future that the people in Iraq now have in front of them. And so when you say Tony Blair should be prosecuted, of course, I strongly agree with you. But not only Tony Blair, he was enabled, Alexandra, by so many different agencies and people, so many ministers, so many law officers, so many Foreign Office grandees, so many journalists and broadcasters. It's almost an Everest of criminal responsibility that we're looking at here.
Yes, I know. Can I just tell you something that a famous Iraqi man said to me many years ago? And he said, it was a black day when they found oil in our country. Now they'll never let us live in peace. The fools don't realize water is more precious. We can live without oil, but we can't live without water.
Indeed. And of course, in a major oil producer like Iraq, there are still, all these years, 18 years after the war, there are still many hours every day where there's no electricity. Just imagine that.
I know what it's like. I'm still in contact with so many people there, family, friends, and even the ones that are scattered. We're all in contact with one another.
God bless you. God bless you, Alexandra, and thank you for that very moving call. I need to take Norma on and in Bristol. Norma, welcome.
Hello, George. I am upset tonight about these scenes in Bristol. I don't live very far away from them. I mean, obviously non-violent protest is absolutely all right, but these scenes are shocking. And, you know, I don't often stick up for police, but the ordinary police constable, they are just trying to do their jobs, and they get scared too. There's 2 police now in hospital. This daft bill Parliament's brought in means that the police are now on the front line, and I'm quite upset, really, George.
Yes, you're entitled to be upset. I'm looking at the pictures now, as are the audience. And of course, the terrible scenes will be used to justify the bill.
I know.
They'll say, you see, this is what we were introducing the bill for.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, but you see, there's one thing that probably you don't know and not many people know, and I might be ostracized for it, but my husband was a policeman for 30 years. He's now 82 years old. He's an old man, but that job was very different in those days. But I know that when these riots go on, and I know there's things on both sides, but some of those policemen are absolutely shitting themselves. They get so scared too, just the ordinary poppy.
Well, far from being ostracized, we are grateful for your husband's service. After all, who needs the police more than the poor? Who needs the police more than the working people who have no one else to defend them? If someone is attacking us or stealing from us or who do we call? We call your husband in the past, and we call these men that are cowering now behind these vans under a hail of stones and so on. That's who we call. It is deeply distressing. Let me read you, they have now contained the demonstrators in New Bridewell Street in the city centre. Hundreds of protesters gathered to demonstrate. The protest is being dubbed Kill the Bill. The New Bridewell police station has been ransacked by protesters. I'm not sure I recall a police station ever being overrun before and ransacked. That must be a major issue for the police. The windows smashed, graffiti daubed on the walls of shops. So shops are now being attacked. And of course, the police vans. There we have a picture of one of them literally on fire. People are now in hospital, including police officers, men just like your husband used to be doing their job. It's a very, very distressing business. I think the bill was entirely ill-conceived. I oppose it entirely, but the riots that and that's what this is, not a protest, the riot we're now watching will only strengthen those who wish to crack down further on our civil liberties. Norma, thank you. I'm sorry for your troubles. I'm sorry that you've been upset by that this evening. Let's hear from Kenny in Falkirk. Go ahead, Kenny.
Hello, George. How you doing?
Good, sir. Nice to hear from you. Go on.
No, it's fantastic to hear from yourself. Are you asking questions? Or
go ahead. Any question. Any question.
Right. I have many questions, right? I phoned the show 2 years ago when Celtic were in the ascendancy, and now they're not. But that doesn't matter. Correct?
I didn't actually hear that. You obviously thought it was funny. Maybe you can maybe you can share it with me.
Right. I saw you in Falkirk, and I was utterly in awe of what you were saying at the time. You destroyed the Nationalists at the time. So many years ago. I want you to come up to Scotland
I'm there, Kenny. It was a temporary relocation. I'll be back. I'll be back on the Scotsman hustings on Tuesday night. You'll be able to follow them. I think my presence is necessary. I think I fight nationalism more effectively than the others. That's my view.
George, can I ask a couple of questions? Just a yes or no, or indeed, give me a George Galloway answer if so be it.
Okay.
Do you think Sturgeon is finished?
I do. Yeah, I don't think she'll be back as the First Minister. I don't think she's going to resign before Wednesday, but I don't think that they're going to win a majority in the election. So I think she's toast. Yeah, I don't think she'll be back as First Minister.
Right. So what are you? I'm going to vote, unfortunately, for the Conservatives and yourself.
Okay.
First and second, as we need to do in Scotland, because if we don't, we have a problem. And the fact that we let the nationalists in by the back door.
Yeah, I think we've got to vote tactically, Kenny, as you're doing.
Yes.
It doesn't matter, Tweedledee or Tweedledum, Labour, Conservative, Liberal, Democrat, who cares? The point is that we need, for just once, to vote tactically, to vote smart.
Correct.
And people like you are already onto that. Kenny, thanks for the call. I've got to take Abdul in Aberdeen. Go ahead, Abdul.
Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
I want to know what are the names? Is there any list of names that that should be prosecuted in the Iraqi war?
Of course, we can't prosecute people in America, but in Britain, Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, Jack Straw, the then Foreign Secretary, Jackie Smith, the then Home Secretary, all the senior figures in the cabinet, the law officers, the people who changed their legal advice that the war would be legal or not legal. There's a long list, Abdul. Now, it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime or yours, but one day, history at least will hold these people to account. History will condemn them. History has already absolved me for my role in the Iraq war. It will not absolve them. They're already condemned, but their names will be written in infamy in history. Abdul, thanks for the call. Asim is in Edinburgh. Last call, Asim, go ahead.
How are you, George? How are you?
By the grace of God, I'm good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope you're keeping safe after recent events.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
That's fine. That's great to hear, sir. Now, my question was very simple. It's obviously, we've been made aware of recent events, the report about the harassment inquiry against the Alex Salmond Harassment Committee. Basically, there's obviously been a bit of a leak about the findings. Nicola Sturgeon has misled Parliament. Now, the question is her or any allies going anytime soon? And obviously, if they are going, who will they be? If it's not going to be Nikki, who else is it then?
Well, as I said to a previous caller, I don't believe that she will resign. You would need a blowtorch to make her blush. And blushing, she's not for doing. She will not resign, but she is in disgrace. Her political position is in tatters. The SNP are going down in flames. They are everywhere exposed for their conspiracy against Alex Salmond, for their lying and covering up of that conspiracy, for their own internal jiggery-pokery, financial selection of candidates, for the disaster that is the fourth road bridge, supposedly the best in the world, but one which has to close whenever there's bad weather because of the ice gathering on the pillars. The failure to build a couple of ferries, the shunting of thousands of our pensioners into care homes to die without protection under the coronavirus, the waste of hundreds of millions of pounds in false guarantees for jobs that were never created, in compensation to people that were maliciously prosecuted. Hundreds of millions of pounds have been wasted, thrown away, mishandled, in some cases, arguably criminally so. If I get into the Scottish Parliament, I've got only one thing to say. Give me a room, a forensic accountant, a legal eagle, and let me open the books. That's the only role I want in Scotland, to open the SNP's books. See you next week.